Hey guys, Navonod on Navonod Hold'em, board to your mothers, namaste bitches, so on and so forth. It's been a couple weeks since I released one of these videos. One of the reasons for that, I just want to touch on this real quick, is for some reason I find myself in this strange situation where the videos that I'm releasing, when they're being watched, they are getting more positive feedback, more coaching inquiries than probably ever before, but the viewership is way down. I don't really know why that is, or I'm not real savvy with optimizing the search engine stuff. But if you could do me a favor, like, subscribe, comment, and especially share these videos. I've got one that has 10,000 views, and a couple that are in the multi-thousands, and then these last ones that are getting some real attention from the people watching them and getting a lot of fanfare are coming in at 200-300 views. So I'd like to remedy that, and if you could help me out with that, that would be amazing. So on to it. Today we're going to be talking about barrel bluffing, and semi-bluffing is obviously going to be a big part of this. But I think that there are some bad ideas and bad notions, and kind of, you all know if you've watched my videos before that I do think that it's a good idea to have some kind of bread and butter, go-to, very simple kind of standard procedures, things that you will usually do, canned kind of framed out methods that you can trust to be fairly accurate the majority of the time, without having to allocate too much of your attention. Because you really, in Know Them Hold 'em, your attention is kind of what you've got. You've got your chips and you've got your cards and you've got your position, but really what you've got that's going to make a big difference between how you perform. Well, and we'll say this: how you perform on a good day and how you perform on a bad day is going to have a lot to do with the way you use your attention. So I do think it's a good idea to set up kind of shortcuts, but we should know kind of what the ABC methods are and what the basics are, what the fundamentals are of each kind of concept. But beyond that, when you find, well, I'll just say this: if you're ever playing poker, and the idea that poker, even at full ring, even at like low stakes cash games at the casino, that's 9 or 10 handed sometimes. Even if you're playing in a situation like that where tight, aggressive is going to be the game, even then, if you feel like this meme about poker being hours of boredom and moments of terror, something like that, then I don't think you're doing it right. There should always be kind of a low level of anxiety, maybe not anxiety, but it should be difficult. The game is difficult, and it's difficult to play well. But even more than that, I mean, you're as good as you are. You know as many things as you know when you sit down to play. At that point, it's too late to learn new things. When you're in game, it's too late to know things you don't know, learn things that you don't know. And your job kind of switches from studying and trying to figure out poker as such, and it switches over to just paying attention. And it shouldn't be boring. It should be kind of difficult. It should be uncomfortable. That's what I'm looking for. So with that in mind, I want to talk about some of the things that are worth thinking about when, I don't know, if you're kind of in a situation where you feel like, yeah, I've got this automated game, I kind of know my strategy, I have this default nice, like, kind of easy and simple, simple framework that I play from, basically understood strategy, and you kind of find yourself going on autopilot. This is one thing that you could choose to pay more attention to, is when we c-bet the flop as pre-flop raiser and we get called, how do we know when to fire another shell? So first of all, these are the basic considerations. Like, what does it take to make a good bluff, a good double barrel or triple barrel bluff? Well, the first thing it takes is a bad hand. Bad in what way? Bad in that if it went to showdown, it would lose very often. Okay, so if we just checked down from this point forward, if your hand is going to lose, to even the weaker parts of your opponent's range, then that's usually at least a hand that you can consider bluffing with. And then what are you representing? What hands does it make sense for you to have? Can you represent a value hand, or is your range just not going to be good? And is your opponent even paying attention? And if we're thinking about double barreling the turn, we need to think about what our opponent called us with on the flop. I mean, you really just can't have much of an idea of how often your opponent is going to fold on the turn unless you have a pretty good idea of what he called with on the flop. It seems obvious, but I think it's a step you could easily skip if you just have this autopilot mentality of, oh, well, an overcard hit the turn, so I bet. Or I improved my equity on the turn, so I bet. Probably not good enough. Kind of a lot of people out there know that. They understand that it's good to have more equity and to semi-bluff, and they understand that you're going to have more kings in your pre-flop range as pre-flop raiser than your opponent is going to have in his calling range as pre-flop caller, and then you're going to bet a lot of those king highs on flops where he's not going to call with near as many king highs on flops, which is it's a smart way to think about it. It's a smart thing to think about, but it's not the end-all be-all. And then really what this all comes down to is basic bet theory. We have to think about what happens when we make a bet. Like when we go for that double barrel, what are we doing? What is the effect of it? Really, when you boil it down to its most fundamental root, kind of brass tacks, what happens when you put money in the pot aggressively? I don't mean slamming it in fast. I mean, when you are the aggressor, when you raise or you bet, or well, I guess that's about it. But when you make this bet on the flop, what's happening to your opponent's range? When the turn card comes out now, and you're pondering making a bet again on the turn, what is that bet going to do? And very simply, what it's going to do is it's going to create fold equity and build a pot. So it's going to create fold equity in the form of getting rid of the weaker hands in your opponent's range. And that's true in theory, but it's also usually true in practice. Your opponent's not going to fold strong hands and call with weak ones. They're usually going to fold the weaker hands, obviously, and continue with the stronger ones. So the more aggressive you get, and that means the more bets that you put in, and also the bigger the bets are, the more aggressive you are, in size of bet and frequency of bets, the more hands you get your opponent to fold. But there's another end of that, is when you do get called, you're getting called by a stronger range. It is a condensed range most of the time. Like if the flop comes out 8-7-2 two-tone and you continuation bet, get called, probably your opponent would have raised with top two. Likely most players would raise with their sets, or a lot of players would on kind of a wet board. So it's gonna be the case that your opponent's range will be more capped. Like he's not gonna have those huge strong hands, but it's also gonna be more bound or bounded, because it's not gonna have the weak hands, because the weak hands fold. And so thinking about your range becoming more and more polarized, where you're not gonna, because you're not gonna bet flop, bet turn, and bomb river with second pair top kicker, or top pair with a bad kicker most of the time. So you don't have like middle strength hands, but your opponent has exactly middle strength hands. And the more aggressive you get, the more bets you put in and the bigger they are, the more your range seems to be polarized and ought to be polarized, meaning you're going to have hands that are very high in value and very low in showdown value, and not a lot in the middle. Your opponent's range is going to become more condensed, where we're getting rid of the poles, because the bottom end is folding to our aggression, and the top end is likely going to raise at some point. So when you check raise flop, bomb turn, and you get to the river thinking about jamming the river, it's important to kind of understand that this is a polarized range on your part, and your opponent has a condensed range. And by looking at the run out and thinking about what specific hands are exactly middle strength hands, that's going to help you know how to size your bluffs, when to take them, when to not take them. So those are considerations. This idea of basic bet theory that basically just stated simply, the more aggressive I get, the more hands my opponents fold, and the stronger their continuance range, but the more capped and bound when our opponent exactly calls. Okay, so the other thing is, I mean, there's this idea of balance, but sometimes we don't need to worry too much about it. The more savvy our opponents are, the more we need to be concerned with it. And also, the more often a situation comes up, the more concerned we have to be about it. I don't really want to be too worried about my, like, check call flop, check, or let's say check raise flop, bomb turn, check call river range. I'm not too concerned about balancing that range because it's very unusual. You know, it doesn't come up very often where you're going to check call flop, check raise turn, and then check and call the river. So all of that being said, balance can be a thing, but when you're thinking about going for multiple bluffs across multiple streets, I mean in the same hand, barrel bluffing, betting flop, betting turn, maybe betting flop, turn, and river, when you're thinking about barreling off, a thing that really makes a big difference and that you need to consider is your equity when called. You know, sometimes it's important to consider your equity against your opponent's continuance range, but a lot of times when we're talking about bluffing, that doesn't matter that much because, I mean, the only thing that really matters is how much equity do you have against your opponent's calling range. Because usually if you're polarized enough, then if you get raised, you're just going to fold anyway. So you don't need to really think about equity when raised so much, you know, not as big a deal. But the big deal is equity when called and lack of showdown value. If you have a hand that's low in showdown value and high in equity when called, then you have a good candidate for a bluff. And especially that's a helpful thing when we're thinking about bluffing across multiple streets. It's this, you know, if you think about what gives you the incentive to make a bluff, it is this lack of showdown value. It's like if we're going to bet some hands but not all hands, I mean, sometimes you just have such a range advantage, you're going to bet your range. But if you're in a spot where you're going to bet some but not all of your range, and you're going to want to bet most of your value hands, and you want to have some bluffs, or you think it's a good opportunity to make a bluff, then if you have a hand that's going to be good fairly often, but if you bet it and get called, it's going to be bad very often, that's oftentimes going to be a waste of your hand. You know, when we're talking about range efficiency, and man, that's the key to a good overall strategy, or it's at least a key. It's using each part of your range as efficiently as possible. It's taking advantage, doing the thing that your hand is specifically good at. That's like, if you can do the thing your hand is good at and kind of weigh that against or modify that by, if you modify it by what your opponent is bad at. If you're like, okay, this is what my hand does well, this is what my opponent does poorly, that's going to get you pretty far. You know, I think you could say, like, in a lot of spots, the rest is just, you know, getting the exact sizing, you know, but that kind of comes back to efficiency too. When we're being ultra efficient, we're not just using every hand to the best of our ability, we're using every chip to the best of our ability. We know what we're targeting. We know what hands are going to try to fold. We're going to try to fold out, and we have an idea of how much or how little we have to risk to accomplish that. But this, if you have good showdown value, if your hand is like, I don't know, a second pair, top pair, weak kicker type hand, it's very rarely a good idea to turn those hands into bluffs, although it can come up in equilibrium strategies. It's not because it's intrinsically good or that it's not intrinsically bad to waste showdown value hands turning them into bluffs, which is something like what you're doing with protection bets if you're betting for protection. It's like when you're betting for protection, what you're actually doing is you're either polarized and you're looking at the fact that you can get value from draws with a value bet even though your hand isn't all that strong. Like sometimes you're betting for thin value against a range that includes draws, and that's a value bet. That's on the value side of the pull, or the value pull, the value side of the spectrum. And sometimes you're turning a hand that has some showdown value into a bluff or like a 5-out semi-bluff, and that's way on the other pull. And so if we're talking and thinking about protection betting, it's like not only do we not need the term protection bet because we already have thin value bet and bluff or semi-bluff, or turning a made hand into a bluff, but also the problem really comes in, I've thought a lot about this, and the problem really comes in that if you're looking at some of your value bets as protection bets and some of your hands that you're turning into bluffs as protection bets, then it can lead you to think that the stuff in the middle, where you shouldn't be betting it, should also be a bet, because you look at it like protection is the thing you're betting for, not thin value, not turning a hand into a bluff, but just protection. And if you're looking at protection as the reason you make the bet, then it causes you to bet those middle hands, quote, for protection, even though it might be the dead center of your range and you might be at complete range parity where you shouldn't be betting very many hands. You might look at this hand that's a really bad hand to bet and think it's a good hand to bet because it has something in common with other hands that are good hands to bet, that are more at the poles. Now sometimes you have a range advantage and you bet even your hands that have medium showdown value, but most of the time you're not going to be able to or want to bet all hands. And so when you're not going to bet everything, the hands that you want to bet are the hands that have the most value when they get called, like the hands that are most likely to win a big pot against even your opponent's stronger calling range. Like, so the nuts or something like it, you want to bet those hands most of the time. And then the other thing is you want to bet hands that do not have a good chance of getting to showdown and winning. If unimproved, they're going to win very rarely, but improved, they're going to win like all the time. Then that's really a slam dunk kind of a bluff candidate. What do we represent? It's like if we're in a situation where we're just not going to get to the street with very many good value combos, like maybe we take a line of c-bet flop as pre-flop raiser on a king 7 deuce rainbow board. Our opponent calls us, and then the turn is like a brick, and it goes check check like we're giving up, and then the river brings a king, and our opponent checks. We're probably not going to want to bet that against a lot of players because they're not going to expect us to have all that many king X in our check back turn range. And in particular, a lot of players will have this leak, and I think it's okay to have this leak against most opponents, that not only will we have very few top pairs in our range that checks the turn back, but if we're going to have some hands in our check back range that are top pair hands, I think most even pretty good players do the check back on the flop. You know, thinking like, I'm going to be able to induce bluffs on the turn, and I can start value betting thinly with like top pair weak kicker if it goes check again on the turn. But very rarely do players take a line where they are pre-flop raiser, they bet flop with top pair, check the turn with top pair, and then bet the river with top pair. And you should have those hands in your range sometimes. But most of the time, if people are going to take a pot control line with their top pairs, I feel like most of the time they do that by checking the flop back. Not always, and it depends on the board, and should depend on the board. But you know, if you just have to realize that even though the king is a better hand or a better card usually for pre-flop raiser than caller, and it probably is the main hand or the main card that is better for pre-flop raiser than pre-flop caller in the vast majority of situations. Like there's even a lot more ace X hands in most players' flatting ranges, especially these days, than king X. You know, it's like because king X suited is not so important. I think that's a big part of it. And you're just gonna play more of your ace X even as a call than you would king X just because the ace is a bigger card, right? So the king is a really good card for you to bet as a bluff. Like if the flop comes king 7 deuce and you're pre-flop raiser and you've got air, betting makes a lot of sense. But once you bet and get called, that means that your opponent has all of the kings left in their range that they started with. So all of the king X hands that your opponent called with pre-flop will still be in there when you bet and they call. And they're not going to have bluffs because they're calling. You know, they might have some floats, but it's really even hard for players to balance that kind of a thing out. And you know, kind of maybe it's not a good idea to even try to have a lot of floats on a king 7 deuce rainbow board if you're a pre-flop caller. You're at a major range disadvantage. So once, even so, you can't look at it like this card is good for my range because I'm pre-flop raiser once you bet and get called on the flop, because it changes, because now you have bet all of your bluffs and you've bet all of your king X and value hands, but your opponent doesn't have bluffs left in his range and he does have kings left in his range. So you can't now give up and check back on the turn, and then when the king comes on the river, try to represent that king against an opponent who knows what they're doing. Most of the time, if they're going to check again on that king 7 deuce check back call, say the 3 of whatever comes off on the turn, check check, and then the king comes out on the river, if they check again, they're probably checking to call. It doesn't make sense for you to have that. So what can you represent, and like what level do you think your opponent is thinking on? Big important concept when we're thinking about, you know, barreling or going for a second barrel bluff, right? So what does villain call the flop with? If we don't know if our opponent has hands that call flop and fold turn, then we don't know if we have a profitable double or triple barrel situation. If we don't have any idea what they might be check calling, then it's really hard to know if we're going to be able to get them to fold by betting again on the turn and or river. So really important to just at least take a second. If you're not good at this at first, and you won't be, but if you're not good at this at first, just understand it's not going to happen by reading a book. It's not going to happen by listening to me talk or watching this video. It's going to happen by practicing it. You actually have to pay attention. Again, it shouldn't be boring to play poker. If anything, it should be a little bit of a pain in the ass, you know? It shouldn't be all like fun and games. You should be pretty tired at the end of an 8-hour session. If you're playing like a 12, 13-hour tournament, and you should be like exhausted by the end. This should always be hard. If it's not difficult, then you're getting lazy. It's like, no, I got better. Doesn't matter. You can always get betterer, right? This is one of the things that you can, if you're finding yourself becoming bored or you think poker's getting easy, and especially if you're like, yeah, poker's pretty easy, but I'm not getting the results I want, do this. Try to figure out what hands your opponent has. And I'm not going to do a big video here on hand reading. I think hand reading 101 is what it's called, maybe, or ranging 101. Look for that. And you know, of course, another big consideration that comes back to what kind of hands our opponent has when they call the flop is not just will they fold if I dub this turn, but also, if not, what happens if I triple barrel? And very often in small and micro stakes, online or live stakes, cash games or tournaments, or small stakes cash games or tournaments live, I advocate, when you get heads up in a pot, continuation betting one and done. Like if you're bluffing, just stabbing one time is a really good idea, because almost universally fish, even though we want to think of fish as calling stations, which they can be, they're normally a calling station before the flop and after the flop, but they're not necessarily a calling station on the flop. Most fish play pretty fit or fold. They're not doing a lot of bluff check raises. They're not doing a lot of floats, especially out of position. They're not going to check and call with nothing to try to steal it on later streets. They're mostly just going to whiff the flop and fold to a c-bet. That's what they're going to mostly do. I've seen databases that would lead me to believe that it's something like 50 to 60% of the time, with kind of standard normal sizings like half pot to 2/3 pot bets. If you size your bet half pot, it only has to get through a third of the time to break even, and that's if you never win the pot once called. And I think that it's hard to find a player, it's hard to find a fish that will not fold more than that on the flop. But once they call the flop, they're probably not going to fold the turn. And even if you get a good double barrel card, I advocate in the low stakes, live or micro stakes online, if you fire the first shell and they call, don't fire the second shell unless it's pristine, meaning that you got a card that heavily favors your range, and especially if you get a card that's going to give you equity, or you already have some kind of equity going. But also, the thing I preach is, if you're going to take that dub, you're almost committing yourself to the triple barrel. Now, you can sometimes have the plan to go for the triple barrel and just give up on it when you get like the worst, river card. But planning to double barrel and shut down, if that's the plan, it's probably not a good plan for small stakes and micro stakes, just because, again, they don't like to fold if they have anything, but they won't call or put a move on if they have nothing. And what does that translate to? Well, it translates to this, that you're going to have good fold equity with your bluffs on the flop. They're going to get very sticky on the turn, but then we can often triple barrel because once we get to the river, their range is way too weak because they do exactly call too often on the turn. So they get to rivers with a lot of hands that aren't strong enough to get to the river with, and a lot of times you can go like bet half pot on the flop, and if they call, then like bet a little bit bigger than half pot on the turn, planning to go for the triple barrel. And important is if you're going for the triple barrel, you probably don't want to like pound a pot size bet in on the turn so often, because you don't want to get to the river where they do actually have this super strong range, which, I mean, it would be fine if you're planning on double barreling and then giving up on the river, but I think the best way to approach these situations, generically speaking, is bet half pot on flop, or bet kind of smaller on flop, a little tiny bit bigger on turn, and then bigger than that on the river. And I think you'd be surprised how profitable those bluffs are going to be, even against players you think are calling stations. So singles and triples are going to be your best bluff lines. Like, we want to be single barrel bluffing and triple barrel bluffing against fish way more often than any other line. We don't want to bet, check, bet. We don't want to bet, bet, check. We don't want to check, bet, bet as often, although that's not as bad. Anyway, basic bet theory. This is what it all comes down to. We've already talked about this, but the more aggressive we get, the more folds we get. But the more folds we get, the stronger our opponent's range gets that continues. And if our opponent doesn't raise, but exactly just calls, then our opponent has a condensed range where they have just mediocre strength hands. Especially on wet boards where players will normally want to raise, quote, for protection with their big hands. If they're not raising, they're exactly calling on a board. Like I said, like 8 of spades, 7 of spades, 2 of diamonds. When they exactly call on the flop, they don't have a weak nothing hand. They've got a draw or a pair. And they don't have like the nuts. They don't have 2 pair plus because they raise most of the time because they're afraid of getting sucked out on. That's like a real indicator of somebody's inexperience is when and just their lack of understanding is it's really an emotional thing to think that poker, that the object of the game is to win every pot you can, but it feels good to win those pots, and it feels bad to get sucked out on when you could have won a pot but didn't. So the emotional reinforcement is all wrong. But there's just like way better ways to think of it. But if you're playing against a mediocre to bad player who's not a complete beginner especially, then chances are when he just calls you on a kind of coordinated board, he doesn't have a set. He doesn't have 2 pair. And so one of the problems with playing too protection oriented is that you end up with capped ranges very often on these wet boards. I mean, like, very often. In fact, if you're calling on a coordinated board, but you are like heavily influenced by the idea that you should try to win the pot when your hand is okay, but won't be good if you're turning a lot of made hands into bluffs, if you're overly mergy, like you're not betting and raising polarized on wet boards, which I think is most players, even decent players. I think that when you're overly merged with your aggression, then, well, I don't think this is the case, that if you're overly merged and not polarized enough with your on wet boards, then what's going to happen is when you call, say you bet call a check raise on the flop, and then on the turn the board is like 8 of spades, 7 of diamonds, 2 of clubs, 2 of hearts, and you call again, then when we get to the river, you have a face-up range. You've got like a busted draw or a top pair or a slight over. You've got like 1 pair or a busted draw. I mean, obviously, if there's a pair of 2s out there, he'll have technically 2 pair, but you know what I mean. You're not going to have like top 2. You're not going to have trips. You're not going to have a set. You're not going to have a boat. Just generically speaking. And what that means is you've just got a lot of weak hands. If you've got a lot of, medium strength to weak hands, that gives me the opportunity to structure my range in such a way that, it wouldn't be that much better for me if you just turned your hand face up and showed it to me. I mean, you essentially have. Like, I know that my bluffs will lose if you call. I know that my value hands will win if you call. And I know where those pulls begin exactly. I know roughly where you're capped, so I can treat every hand stronger than whatever your best hand is as the nuts. That's like, that's huge. That's crazy. You should never let somebody do that to you. That's like just walking right into the vice grip. I mean, that's just like, go ahead, put my head in the vice. I deserve it. I like it. So don't do that unless you hate money. Like maybe money picked on you when you were a kid or stole your lunch money. So basic bet theory is just that as we aggress, our range gets more and more polarized because at some point we're going to slow down with our medium strength hands, but we're not necessarily going to slow down with the pulls, meaning like our best hands and our worst hands in terms of showdown value especially. So the more we aggress and the more you can, like, the more hero aggresses and the more villain complies, the more polarized hero's range becomes and the more condensed showdown value bluff catcher type hands that villain has in his range. And so when we can put our opponent in the classic polar versus bluff catcher scenario, it's exceedingly difficult to lose. Okay, so equity when called is a big thing, right? It's important, and this is kind of the way to think about it. I think this is like the best way to think about double barreling, triple barreling, even c-betting as a bluff, just bluffing in general. The thicker our bluffs, the better, and the more equity we have against the hands that continue against us, the better. And I shouldn't say better, I think I should say the more incentivized. So like, by thicker bluffs, I mean that we're going to get a lot of better hands to fold. And when we have, like, say on that 8-7-2 two-tone board, when we have like 10-9, we've got 10 high, right? So when we have 10 high, our opponent, if they fold jack high, that is a slam dunk victory. We have done a lot of work with our aggression. We want a pot that we're going to lose very often. But even when we get called by pocket aces, or pocket queens, I guess, if it was a flat call pre-flop, even if we get called by an overpair, we're still very live. You know, if we might have, depending on what suits and all of that, well, on the flop, if we've got an open-ended straight draw and like a backdoor flush draw, maybe like, yeah, like if we have that, we've also got runner to like two pair and stuff. We could have like, 40% equity, something like that, against even the hands that call. And if we have something like 30 to 50% equity against our opponent's calling range with a given hand, but we also would only have like, 55% against, or even, well, I'll put it this way. If we knew that we only had 50% equity against the worst hands in our opponent's range, and we still had 50% equity against the best hands in our opponent's range, holy shit, that should be the ultimate thing that tells you I cannot not bluff with this hand. Like, this is a perfect, pristine bluff. Now, you have to take the other things into account. Do you need to worry about coverage and balance and all of the things? Like, can you, represent a strong hand here? But usually, if you're aggressing across multiple streets, you're going to have some hands in your range that can do that. If you never did anything to cap your range, then you can always at least have like sets. You can always have like top pair, over pair sets. So yeah, if you can just think of it like this, just remember these things. The weaker your hand is in showdown value, like the more often it will lose against the hands that would fold if you bet. I mean, isn't this obvious? The more often my hand would lose if my opponent has one of the hands he would have folded had I bet, the more I should bet, the more often I should bet. Like, if we have already a hand that's going to beat most of the hands that would fold if we bet, then we don't have that much incentive to bet. But if we have a hand where our opponent, pretty much anything they fold is going to be a big victory for us because those hands would at least have a lot of equity against us, then we have that incentive to aggress. But if you look at it also, that not only, and that's called having a thick bluff, like there's tons of bluff targets, tons of hands that are better than ours. or have like a lot of equity against ours, that means our bluff would be a thick bluff because it's got a lot of bluff targets. But if you also have a lot of equity even against the hands that continue against you, then it's kind of like it doesn't get any more pristine than that. I mean, the only thing that can make it better than that is if you have a range advantage, or if you hit a card on the turn that favors your range compared to your opponent's. And what do those cards look like? It's usually over cards. I think we'll have to revisit that. But here, oh my goodness, I didn't even realize I was giving almost the identical example. I was not reading this, but okay, so I guess that's not two examples really. It's pretty much the same thing. But that king on the turn that we just saw in that example would have been a very good card for us to dub, because we would have had like our king queens and ace kings that might bet, king queens and king jacks that probably would bet, and he's not going to have as many kings in his flop calling range, because a lot of his kings either 3-bet pre-flop or fold on the flop. So when that king comes and we still have all this equity and it's an overcard to the board, it turns his second pairs into third pairs, his top pairs into second pairs, some of his over pairs into not over pairs, and he already folded the kings in his range, or didn't have them because some of them 3-bet or folded them on the flop. Then when we get to the turn and we still have all of our kings and they don't have their kings, and it makes their range weaker, and so it makes our range stronger, and we still have equity, that's a really good opportunity to double barrel. Are we balanced, and does it matter? So really, this is just, the question is, and I'm just going to reform this a little bit, do we have enough value hands in our range that we can bluff with whatever hand that we're thinking about bluffing with? And do we have more or better bluffing candidates in our arsenal that if we use this one it would be over bluffing? So like, if you're thinking about taking a bluff, you need to ask, is this one of the best hands I can bluff with? And if it's not nearly one of the best hands you can bluff with, then you have to have a lot of value hands to justify using it as a bluff, or you have to know that your opponent is going to overfold in whatever situation that you're in. So are we balanced, and does it matter? Meaning, is our opponent even capable of thinking about that? Or if he is he going to over-adjust, allowing us to like counter-exploit his attempted exploitation? That's getting kind of meta. But just basically, if your opponent is watching, if he's paying attention, then you just have to know like what kind of, like, where your hand fits into your range and like how much it matters. Okay, so here's some examples versus a standard kind of fish he's a calling station pre-flop. He plays very fit or fold on the flop. He gets sticky on the turn, and then plays kind of normal on the river. I think that some villains, some fish, will overfold rivers and some will underfold rivers, but I think on balance I think you can just play something close to approximating a GTO type strategy on the river. Just bet like your best and worst hands if you're the polar player, and you'll probably do pretty well. Or there's no reason necessarily to believe that an unknown villain is going to be different than that, so you can just kind of play it as if they're sort of normal, sort of average. So against a standard fish, he calls too often pre-flop, he whiffs a lot of flops, he plays fit or fold on the flop, he calls too often on turns, but he folds at least a decent amount on rivers. It's one situation. But if it's a thinking rag, where you do have to be more worried about balance, it's another situation. So let's look at these two examples. We've got Jack of Spades, Ten of Spades. The flop is Queen 8-2 Rainbow. We bet the flop, so we're pre-flop raiser. We get called. So let's say we're cut off and he's button or big blind. He's big blind. We bet the flop and he calls, and then the turn is the King of Spades. Should we bet that against a sticky fish? Now let's look at the other example versus a thinking rag. We open cutoff, he calls from the big blind. Flop is Queen 8 Deuce two-tone. We bet the flop, and we get that same king turn. So if our opponent is going to call us too often on the turn, then the first thing we should be thinking is, let's not bluff the turn. right? Now, if our opponent is a kind of standard calling station fish who he's going to play fit or fold on the flop, he's got too many hands going to the flop, but when he hits, he doesn't fold. And once he calls on the flop, he's unlikely to fold the turn. And we don't really know what he's going to do on the river. He's probably going to play like decent, or we don't have any specific way to exploit him on the river. We probably want to just check back on the turn. And I know that sounds crazy because you pick up all that equity, right? Like you've got now a flush draw and you've got a straight draw. You've got a straight flush draw to Broadway. You've got like a royal flush draw. And like, why would you ever not bet a royal flush draw? Well, just remember, guys, you don't lose your equity by taking a free card. It's not like the equity you have in the hand somehow like vanishes because you checked. What you really need to ask yourself is, by betting, am I creating more fold equity than I'm costing myself in EV by betting? Obviously, right? And usually the question is going to be answered very simply by, does my opponent underfold or overfold in this spot? Like, a lot of players, and a lot of my students in past especially, they have a real hard time with this idea because they're thinking like, well, I can prove that this is a profitable double barrel. And they go through the steps and they're like, look, I've got this much fold equity, I'm putting this much money in the pot, I've got this much equity when called, how is this not a slam dunk double barrel? Well, the problem there, the little kind of thing that they're doing, the little trick that they're playing on themselves, is they're actually comparing double barrel semi-bluffing to putting their hand in the muck and walking away from the table. Those aren't the only two options. So just because you can prove that the double barrel is very profitable, that does not mean that you should do it. I'm going to say that one more time. Just because you can prove, just because it is the case, and you can prove it's the case, and you know it's the case, that double barrel bluffing is very profitable, that does not mean you should do it. Because you have to ask, profitable compared to what? If it's profitable at all, that doesn't tell you what you should do. Like if you have enough equity and could generate enough fold equity, then what you shouldn't do is you shouldn't leave. You shouldn't throw your hand into the muck. So having equity doesn't tell you to bluff. It just tells you not to fold. That's all it really tells you to have like a lot of equity is don't fold. Or be very reluctant to fold. It doesn't tell you definitely be aggressive. Because if you check back, you still have your equity. But if you miss, then you didn't waste the money of the bluff. So if the bluff isn't going to make a profit in a vacuum, then, there are some implied odds and pot geometric ways to think about this that can make it different than what I'm about to say. But most of the time, and keeping it simple, when your bluff, if the bluff itself, if you did not have equity, if you, like, just imagine in this Jack 10 of spades, on Queen 8 Deuce King 2 spades, we know that betting there is going to be profitable because we get fold equity, and we grow a bigger pot and lock up equity when we hit. And even if we get a triple barrel bluff, we win a bigger pot and all of that, right? We know it's going to be profitable. But the way to figure out if you should actually take the double barrel or check it back, because we also know checking back is going to be profitable, right? It's like you're getting infinite pot, like infinite to 1 pot odds. You're not having to risk anything. You have this big potential gain. So how do we know whether to check back or to bluff? If you had 7-5 offsuit, so if you just had two napkins, if you had cards that had nothing painted on them, there's no pictures. Your Jack and 10 are nothing. You just have 2 live cards. Not live in the fact that they're live cards, but you have a live hand, I should say. But that's all you had. If all you have is like 7 high, then ask yourself, would this bet on the turn, if I had no equity, would it make money? Would the bluff be a good bluff? So, in other words, would the semi-bluff, would the bluff portion of the semi-bluff work without the semi part of the semi-bluff? If not, you might want to think check back. And if so, if the bluff would turn a profit by itself, or if it would be close, but you think you can make more than up for it with a bigger pot on the river in position, something like that, or if you know he's going to call flop, call turn, and overfold rivers or something like that, this can definitely change. But all else considered equal, you could just ask yourself, would my bluff, the bluff part of this turn a profit? And if not, don't do it. Unless you can make up for it on the river, or more than make up for it on the river. Okay, so your equity does not vanish just because you don't double barrel. You still have it. You can still hit the river, and when you do, a lot of times it'll give your opponent an excuse to call you. So it could actually be, and you don't want to make the implied odds argument. It's a bad argument, really. Like that, well, yeah, but if I had bet, then he called, then we'd get to the river, he'd have a stronger range, so my implied odds would be better. Well, then you're not using the term right. Like, implied odds is always a ratio, right? Like, your implied odds should be looked at like pot odds, but it should be the pot as it is now and how big do I expect it to be on average when I win. So like, if you think, for instance, you can get another, if you make your hand, you can get another $100 paid off on the river. So there's a $100 pot now, and you think that you can, if you hit your hand, you can make $100 more on the river 50% of the time, then you can kind of just take that 50% of the bet you would make on the river and take that 50%, which if it's a $100 bet you're going to make and you expect your opponent to call half the time when you bet, then just take that 50% of 100, which is $50, and move it into the current pot. So if there's a $100 pot, you're going to make a $100 bet when you make your hand, you expect it to work half the time or get called half the time, then you can say that there's like another $50 in the pot. That's my method for working with implied odds, but I think it's pretty good. So you can just look at it like, instead of that if I make this, if I could make this bet on the river, or let's say, yeah, I mean that's roughly the formula that I use, but I'm trying to think of how to put it in context, because we're not really calling for pot odds, but if we're talking about implied odds, we need to talk about it in terms of a ratio. That's the point. So if we were pondering a call, if we had this hand, like we're on this turn and villain led into us, let's say he bet 50 into 100, or let's say he bet 50 into 50, then we'd know that there's the 50 in the pot now, and there's 50% of the $100 I'm going to bet on the river if I hit my hand, because I think he's going to call half the time, and we could add that 50 to this 50. Basically, it's still going to be a ratio. Like, whatever we're putting at risk compared to what we expect the size of the pot to be, which is the size of the pot now, plus whatever bet size we're going to use on the river by what percent we expect it to get paid off. Hopefully that makes some kind of sense to you. If not, hopefully you just trust me and get the point. Now versus a thinking regular, the same situation, we should almost certainly go for the double barrel in this example, because it's going to be like our thinking regs are going to fold this turn pretty often, because they're going to call here with like pocket nines, like ace-8 suited, even some of their weaker queen X's, which are all hands that could fold if we bet again on the turn. And that villain can easily put us on pocket kings for a set of kings, or king-queen for 2 pair, or ace-king with maybe like ace of spades, well, ace of diamonds, king of diamonds, that has like 2 overcards, backdoor flush draw, backdoor straight draw, and then we hit the king, or maybe he's a thinking player. He's going to hit the fold button more often than a fish would on the turn, right? And then even if he does continue, then we still have the river where we can make a bluff if we get the right kind of card against our opponent, or we can get there, and then we have the implied odds of that. So, but on this queen 8 deuce deuce, this is not a good. It's not a good turn card to barrel against a thinking regular, because this is not a scary card to him. Like, he doesn't think that we have 2s in our preflop range as often as we have kings, and if he's a good thinking player, he's going to recognize this as a good card for his range, which could cause him to even turn a hand into a bluff. But more importantly, if he called us with any kind of queen, he's not going to fold it on the turn. His hand kind of got relatively better. Even if he has like pocket nines here, he loves this card. You know, it's just that much less likely that we've got a big hand. You know, we've got less pocket two combos. We probably check back our twos on the flop anyway. We probably don't have that many to begin with. We're betting again, which kind of polarizes our range a little bit, which means he can bluff catch more effectively in some ways, or his hero calls can make sense. This is not a good turn card to double barrel. He could have, if he has any 2x, he might peel once on queen 8 deuce. And then he gets there with trips, but more importantly, the bulk of hands that he has, not only are they not devalued, but our betting range starts to look a little bit more suspicious. It's just not a scary card, or shouldn't be. So yeah, that's about that. That's about that, in fact. Okay, so here's some final thoughts, and in fact, I think we'll just run through this quick. Low showdown value plus high equity when called is the nut bluff. Fishy players tend to overfold flop, underfold turn, and we don't really know what they're going to do on the river unless we know that fish specifically. So c-bet flop often, don't double barrel the turn often unless you think the turn card is great for your range, bad for your opponent's range, and or you're going to get more folds with the third barrel on the river. Tend to either bet flop and give up with your bluffs, or bet flop, bet turn, and bet river versus most fish. Remember, there is a reverse correlation between fold equity and implied odds. We didn't get into that very much, but basically, the more often your opponent is going to not fold, the better your implied odds are by definition. That becomes very important when you're thinking about taking a free card off with your draw or double barreling. It's like if your opponent is not going to fold very often, then you are going to have more implied odds when you hit your hand, but don't use that always as an argument to become aggressive. Your implied odds get better because they're a fraction, a ratio, when you don't have to put money into the pot. You know, like, for sure, definitely, by definition, it has to be. How else could it be? And it is okay to just take your equity. It's not the cardinal sin that people think it is. Like, when you have a scary card that comes off on the turn and you've got equity, sometimes you should bet it. And if you improve your equity but it's not a scare card, then most of the time you should not bet it. And just think about the hands that call on the flop and fold on the turn. And if you can't think of any hands that call on the flop and then fold the turn, then don't bet the turn as a bluff. Not even a semi-bluff. Not even if you have all the equity in the world. If you just can't think of what hands your opponent would call with on the flop and then fold to a dub on the turn, then don't take the dub on the turn, no matter how much equity you have. Your equity doesn't vanish when you don't bet. You still have the equity. Efficiency is king, and hopefully this video has helped you to help yourself to become more helpful to helpers, or something like that. Until next time. Oh, if you have any comments or if you have any questions, please ask them in the comment section. I do try to get back to all of them, actually. I think I succeed most of the time. Until next time, word to your mothers, namaste bitches, and good luck. And the luck is in quotations there. So good, quote, L-U-C-K, end quote, good luck. East side until I die. And peace out, homies.